The next time you walk down the grocery aisle and reach for a standard can of tuna or the basic soup, you aren't just buying food. You are participating in the final, quiet moments of a pricing structure that no longer exists in reality. Most consumers operate under a comforting illusion, the belief that the price on the shelf is a direct reflection of the product inside the tin. It isn't. What you are paying for is a complex, fragile web of international metal markets, retaliatory tariff schedules, and collapsing regional water tables. The actual contents, the fish, the beans, the tomatoes, are practically an afterthought in the corporate balance sheets. Right now, a series of invisible traps is springing shut across 15 specific canned staples, and the data shows that the gap between wholesale contract realities and retail shelf prices is about to close violently. Take a look at how this ecosystem actually functions. When a major food conglomerate like Conagra or Campbell's negotiates packaging or ingredient costs, they aren't looking at next week. They are locked into institutional supply agreements written 6 to 9 months ago. What you see on the grocery shelf today is a ghost from the past, a delayed snapshot of a stable market that has already dissolved behind the scenes. This creates a massive open loop for anyone paying attention. A handful of hyper-specific regulatory decisions, maritime treaty rewrites, and domestic steel shortages are converging on the exact same grocery aisle simultaneously. If you understand which 15 items are sitting directly in the crosshairs of these multi-layered pressures, you can exploit this temporary timing gap before the pricing completely catches up to the data. Number 15. Canned green beans. Whether you choose Del Monte, Green Giant, or a budget store label, the humble green bean is the perfect case study for a product where the vegetable isn't the economic driver, the container is. A sealed can of low-acid vegetables requires commercial retort sterilization, a heavy-duty, high-heat pressurized process that guarantees shelf stability for 2 to 5 years. But that long-term safety net relies entirely on an uninterrupted supply of specialized packaging tin plate. Domestic steel production cannot keep pace with canning demand, forcing manufacturers into a shrinking, highly contested pool of global metal suppliers. The price of the steel wrapped around those green beans has quietly outpaced the value of the agricultural yield inside. The current retail price is a lagging indicator, safe for now under expiring corporate hedges, but completely exposed to the next quarterly contract renewal. Number 14. Canned sweet corn. Just like green beans, sweet corn offers excellent caloric density and a long-term rotation window of up to 5 years because its starches hold up remarkably well under retort conditions. But the hidden anomaly here lies in the psychological trap of the supermarket store brand. Shoppers often reach for the generic option, assuming it represents a permanent safe haven from inflation. It doesn't. Store brands don't escape packaging cost spikes. They simply absorb them on a delayed fuse. National brands pass cost increases down to retailers aggressively to protect their margins, while private labels hold the line longer to capture market share. This creates a temporary artificial price gap that makes consumers feel safe. It's a timing illusion. The manufacturer contracts backing both the premium label and the generic can are negotiated in the exact same fiscal windows, and when those private label buffers run out, the price correction is sudden and steep. Number 13. Canned tomatoes. This is where the pressure multiplies. While green beans and corn suffer from a single packaging bottleneck, canned tomatoes are being squeezed from 3 completely independent directions at once. First, the structural metal deficit. Conagra, the parent company of Hunt's, has openly flagged margin compression tied directly to surging steel and aluminum inputs. Second, a highly specific regulatory bottleneck. Tomato products have become a primary target for intensified import enforcement actions at the US border, focusing heavily on supply chain labor verifications. Third, a stark geographic reality. Mexican tomato production, a vital lifeblood for North American processors, is projected to drop nearly 3% due to severe systemic drought across its core growing regions. You have a materials crisis, an enforcement crisis, and a climate crisis, all colliding on a single item that only boasts an 18-month to 2-year quality window due to its natural acidity. Number 12. Canned tomato paste. If diced tomatoes are facing a multi-front assault, tomato paste represents that exact same crisis in a highly concentrated form. It shares the same abbreviated shelf life constraints, but its structural vulnerability is amplified by how targeted the regulatory landscape has become. Federal border enforcement documentation doesn't just mention tomatoes broadly. It singles out tomato paste explicitly alongside raw commodities, like cotton. Government agencies are tracking this specific derivative with surgical precision, creating an invisible friction point that standard retail consumers never see until the shelves suddenly go bare. When a vital foundational cooking element like paste experiences supply contraction, the market doesn't just get more expensive. It loses its operational flexibility. Number 11. Canned chicken noodle soup. This isn't a matter of reading between the lines of agricultural forecasts. This is corporate leadership stating the crisis under legal obligation to shareholders. Campbell's CEO Mick Dubazin went on the record during institutional investor communications to reveal a staggering reality. Tariffs on imported steel and aluminum account for more than half of the company's total projected duty costs for the entire fiscal year. More than half. The absolute dominant cost driver for one of the most iconic food brands in history has nothing to do with chickens, noodles, or broth. Furthermore, the company explicitly admitted that domestic supplies of the specific steel derivatives required for their canning processes are fundamentally insufficient. When a market titan confesses that it cannot source enough domestic material to bypass international trade penalties, the price on the shelf ceases to be a stable reality. It is an absolute flaw, and that flaw is already shifting beneath us. The structural trap governing modern canned food pricing was not built overnight. It is the direct mathematical result of decades of industrial optimization, trade litigation, and geographic dependencies that have left the American supply chain structurally exposed. To understand how the system reached this breaking point, it is necessary to examine the raw materials that form the basis of the entire canning industry. The United States market consumes approximately 20 to 25 billion cans of food annually. However, domestic production of prime tinplate, the thin, tin-coated steel sheets required to manufacture food-grade containers, has been in a steep documented decline for more than a quarter of a century. According to industrial manufacturing data, domestic mills currently supply less than half of the tinplate required by United States container manufacturers, creating an absolute reliance on foreign import markets. This materials deficit turned into an economic bottleneck following specific federal policy actions. In January of 2024, the United States Department of Commerce issued a formal final determination in an ongoing anti-dumping duty investigation targeting tin mill products. The federal government imposed definitive anti-dumping duties on tinplate imports from major suppliers, including Canada, China, and Germany, while simultaneously applying countervailing duties on Chinese tin mill imports. The regulatory intent was clear: protect the domestic steel industry from foreign underpricing. But the geographic reality of food production created an immediate paradox. While the tariffs protected raw metal producers, they penalized the food processors who relied on that metal to package agricultural yields. Food manufacturing trade associations filed public oppositions during the International Trade Commission hearings, warning that these targeted tariffs would increase food production costs by up to 30%. The warnings were ignored, and the tariff schedules were locked in. The historical trajectory of number 10, canned beef stew, demonstrates exactly how these historical decisions intersect with logistical constraints. In the mid-20th century, conglomerates like Hormel scaled the distribution of heavy, meat-based stews like Dinty Moore by utilizing cheap, localized rail transport and abundant domestic packaging. As the domestic tinplate industry consolidated, production shifted to centralized hubs, increasing transportation distances for raw, empty cans. Simultaneously, global livestock dynamics changed. The domestic cattle herd in the United States reached its lowest inventory level in decades by 2025, driven by multi-year droughts in the Southwest and rising grain feed expenses. Because a canned stew requires a combination of high-density protein, root vegetables, and thick broth, manufacturers found themselves purchasing every single component from a separate inflating market. To compound this resource squeeze, meat products cannot be processed using standard low-temperature sterilization methods. Under food safety regulations mandated by the United States Food and Drug Administration, low-acid meat products must undergo prolonged commercial retort sterilization at temperatures exceeding 240 degrees Fahrenheit to eliminate dangerous pathogens. This thermal process is highly energy-intensive. When industrial natural gas and electrical grid prices experienced sharp volatility over the last several fiscal quarters, the energy cost baked into every single unit of canned stew multiplied. Manufacturers could not reduce the cooking time or lower the temperature without violating federal safety laws, meaning the operational cost of processing the food remained completely inflexible. The structural vulnerability becomes even more acute when looking at specialized imports. As seen in the history of number 8, canned coconut milk. Unlike green beans or corn, coconut milk has zero domestic agricultural base within the continental United States. The entire supply chain for major brands like Thai Kitchen and Chowco is anchored in Southeast Asia, primarily within concentrated agricultural zones in Thailand. Historically, this product was treated as a cheap, high-margin ethnic specialty item. However, over the past decade, global consumer demand for plant-based fats and shelf-stable dairy alternatives escalated, transforming coconut milk into a mainstream pantry staple. This surged import volumes right into a maritime logistics trap. The geographic reality of the Thai supply chain means that every container of coconut milk destined for the United States market must pass our major Pacific shipping lanes and clear specific ports of entry, such as the Port of Los Angeles or the Port of Long Beach. In recent years, maritime line shipping rates have been subjected to unprecedented volatility, driven by canal disruptions, fuel surcharges, and container shortages. Furthermore, because Thailand operates under specific bilateral trade agreements with the United States, any adjustment to generalized system of preferences tariff schedules immediately shifts the cost baseline of the product. Because there is no domestic agricultural fallback, no fields of coconut palms in the Midwest to offset a Pacific trade dispute. The price pass-through to the consumer is direct, instantaneous, and complete. The historical baseline for number 7, canned kidney and pinto beans, reveals a different kind of trap, an institutional reliance that masks systemic vulnerabilities. For generations, the production of canned dry beans was considered the most stable sector of American food processing. Organizations such as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints built entire multi-generational welfare and home storage systems around dry and canned beans, recognizing them as an unbeatable source of low-cost protein and fiber. This massive, consistent institutional demand led agricultural sectors in states like North Dakota, Michigan, and Minnesota to optimize their operations entirely for high-volume, low-margin output. But this hyper-optimization created a hidden geographic vulnerability. Dry bean crops are highly sensitive to soil moisture and precise harvest windows. When regional weather patterns shifted, causing erratic planting seasons across the northern plains, crop yields fluctuated wildly. Because the retail price of a can of beans has historically been kept under $2 to appeal to lower-income demographics, processors operate on razor-thin profit margins. They cannot absorb a 10% increase in crop acquisition costs, nor can they absorb the escalating costs of the tinplate containers. The institutional model that worked perfectly during periods of predictable agricultural input costs and cheap steel collapses when both variables experience simultaneous upward pressure. The long-term stability of the product is no longer supported by cheap production. It is held up entirely by legacy inventory that is rapidly depleting. The structural vulnerabilities built into domestic manufacturing are now colliding with direct regulatory interventions in the global seafood trade. On January 1, 2026, the United States formally implemented a major regulatory action under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. This import provision, directly targeting foreign commercial fisheries, altered the baseline costs for multiple high-volume canned proteins. The rule requires any harvesting nation exporting fish or fish products to the United States to possess a valid comparability finding from the National Marine Fisheries Service. This finding certifies that the exporting nation maintains marine mammal protection standards equivalent to United States domestic regulations. Foreign fisheries that utilize high-risk harvesting technologies such as drift nets, gill nets, and entanglement lines have been systematically denied compliance status. www.fisheries.nr.gov. Issue 3. The mathematical scale of this regulatory shift is documented in international trade audits. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration estimates that these import prohibitions directly impact approximately $3.6 billion worth of seafood trade, out of a total $25.8 billion in annual United States seafood imports. Under the active enforcement mechanism, any incoming shipment from a non-compliant fishery must present a government-issued certificate of admissibility at the port of entry. The United States importer of record must electronically upload this documentation into the Customs and Border Protection Automated Commercial Environment System within 24 hours of a shipment's release. If the documentation is missing, inaccurate, or flagged under specific harmonized tariff schedule codes, customs officials deny entry. www.oceantreasure.com. Issue 1. This regulatory net sits squarely on top of number 3, canned sardines and mackerel. Brands like Wild Planet and King Oscar operate in a global market where smaller pelagic fish are heavily exposed to these new operational rules. Chile and Ecuador, which serve as primary regional sources for wild-caught mackerel and sardines, utilize trawling and net systems that have triggered deep compliance scrutiny. Because these species have historically been treated as cheap alternative proteins, processing margins are incredibly tight. The administrative burden of securing bilateral certificates, combined with the outright ban on specific foreign regional fleets, has restricted the physical volume of fish entering domestic processing pipelines. Importers are forced to compete for a limited pool of certified compliant catches, driving up wholesale spot prices before the fish ever reach a domestic canning facility. www.oceantreasure.com. Simultaneously, number 2, canned salmon, is experiencing a separate supply contraction driven by national security policies and parallel environmental legislation. The United States maintains a strict ban on Russian-origin seafood products, which was expanded to include fish harvested in Russian waters, but processed in third-party countries such as China. This specific restriction effectively neutralized large segments of the global salmon and whitefish processing chains. Historically, massive quantities of wild salmon caught in the North Pacific were shipped to Chinese facilities for filleting, canning, and re-export to North American grocery chains. That logistical pipeline is now illegal for United States market entry. www.oceantreasure.com. This policy change forced corporate buyers to shift their entire procurement infrastructure toward domestic wild Alaskan fisheries and certified Canadian operations. This sudden concentration of purchasing power triggered a profound market imbalance. While the domestic labeling on wild Alaskan salmon shields the product from direct import tariffs, it exposes the item to internal capacity limits. Alaskan canning operations face rigid seasonal harvest windows mandated by state conservation laws and are limited by localized labor availability. When a multi-billion-dollar corporate buyer moves their demand from international waters to a restricted domestic fishery, procurement costs climb sharply. The consumer sees a premium product on the shelf, but the price inflation is driven by regulatory exclusion, not a lack of fish in the ocean. This brings the structural collapse directly to number 1, canned tuna. Brands like Starkist, Bumblebee, and Chicken of the Sea occupy the central core of the entire shelf-stable protein market, and they are currently absorbing shocks from 3 separate institutional mechanisms simultaneously. The first mechanism is the annual tariff rate quota administered by the United States government on tuna imported in airtight containers. This quota places a rigid cap on the volume of canned tuna that can enter the country at a preferred duty rate of 6%. Once the historical import volume ceiling is breached, within a calendar year, the duty rate automatically escalates to 12.5% for all subsequent entries. This recalculation occurs automatically without legislative intervention, creating an immediate cost step-up that tracking data shows is hitting earlier each consecutive fiscal year. The second mechanism is the targeted enforcement of Section 301 tariffs on Chinese manufacturing. Canned tuna products containing fish processed or packaged within Chinese borders face a flat 25% tariff rate penalty, because the global fishing fleet relies heavily on decentralized maritime hubs for value-added processing. These penalty structures systematically inflate production costs for national brands that rely on cross-border logistics, The third and most disruptive mechanism is the ongoing implementation of the International Agreement to Eliminate Harmful Fisheries Subsidies, monitored by global trade bodies. This structural treaty is designed to dismantle the state-funded fuel and vessel subsidies that historically allowed massive distant water fishing fleets to operate continuously in international waters. As nations scale back these financial supports to comply with international law, the operational cost of running deep-sea longline and purse seine tuna vessels has increased. The high seas fleets that harvest skipjack and albacore tuna are catching fewer fish per dollar expended. This triple exposure represents a perfect operational trap. You have a rigid domestic import quota, a punitive country of origin tariff structure, and a global treaty dismantling the artificial financial supports of the commercial fishing fleet. These three separate systems do not coordinate with one another, yet they converge on the exact same grocery aisle. The individual brands printed on the labels are functionally irrelevant because no amount of corporate marketing can alter the underlying math of the supply chain. The historical era of cheap, infinite canned tuna has reached its definitive end, driven by an institutional vise that is tightening by the week.